Hey there, thank you for waiting for us and welcome to Scholars Strike Canada 2022, defund, demilitarize, and abolish police prisons and all forms of carcerality. Welcome to our afternoon teach-in, ending extractivism. Over the next 75 minutes, we are going to try to answer how our battles against extractivism also battles against policing, how are abolition and Indigenous sovereignty linked, and what kinds of activations, practices, and direct actions are needed to imagine, plot, and end global extractivism. Before we get started, we'll all introduce ourselves. We'll tell you where we are coming from or the place we are coming to this conversation from. We'll tell you a little bit about our work or project or past or current issue that we are using to grapple with these questions. And today we have joining us myself, Kristen Boss, Uahikea Maile, Nick Estes, and Isabel Altamirano-Jiménez, who's not quite with us yet, but may join momentarily. And before we begin, I want to thank Gregorio for our ASL and Denise, who will be doing our closed captioning. We are very grateful for you helping us make this more accessible. So I'll let Uahikea introduce themselves.
Aloha mai kākou, o wau o Uahikea Maile, he kanaka mauli au, he kanaka Hawaii au. Aloha everybody, I am Uahikea Maile. I am a kanaka mauli practitioner, organizer, and professor. I'm an assistant professor of Indigenous politics at the University of Toronto, St. George, here in Takarano on Dish with One Spoon, Treaty Territory. In the Department of Political Science. I'm also an affiliate faculty in Center for Indigenous Studies, Center for the Study of the United States. I'm the vice president and editor of Red Media, which is a Indigenous publishing house and media organization, media by Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, and by any media necessary. I specifically study a few really important things that I think I'm going to bring into this conversation today in my research, but it's also research that's very much so wrapped up in activist organizing back home in Hawaii, and also organizing and advocacy here in Takarano, across Ontario and Canada with the Canadian federal government revolving around the 30-meter telescope project, which is a proposed development project that Canada has invested about $300 million in to develop a extremely large telescope. And that is a technical scientific term, extremely large telescope, super innovative, at our sacred mountain, Mauna Kea on Hawaii Island. And so in 2019, a recent iteration of a Kanaka Maoli blockade formed, and we reoccupied territory at the base of Mauna Kea to prevent construction from occurring for the first time, and successfully stopped construction. And meanwhile, in the past 3 years, there have been new developments that have continued to just completely override the loud and resounding no and ole from our community. Currently, there is no free, prior, informed consent that has been obtained, and that is a total social fact that no Canadian astronomer or TMT agent can prove. But in the past 3 years, nevertheless, they've organized to bypass that violation of free, prior, informed consent for a development project on Indigenous national territory that's unceded and also a sacred mountain that we practice Hawaiian religion and spirituality. And so I'll talk a little bit about that 2019 struggle while I was there in regards to extraction police, but also the way that astronomy is extractive, and how it's wrapped up in global circuits of extractivism. And I'll pass it back to you. Great. Yeah.
Good. I'm excited to hear what you've got to offer this afternoon. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Amatakiapi, Napi Chuzapi, Chante Washte, Nick Estes Machapi. My name is Nick Estes. I am a organizer with the Red Nation. I also co-host Red Nation podcast. I will be joining the faculty of the University of Minnesota's American Indian Studies Department in the fall of this year. I'm also published several books on the history of like Native activism and movements. And currently, I'm working on some sort of different projects, historical projects of Indigenous-led social movements, both internationally as well as within the confines of, the so-called United States. And also looking specifically at how extractivism on Indigenous lands really corresponds with not just policing, but also kind of geopolitical machinations of US empire, and how the kind of promise of decarbonization, both in Canada and the United States, really just keeps in place certain modes of not only extractivism, but certain modes of colonial, relations with Indigenous people. So that's really what I've been focusing on recently. And yeah, I'm happy. Oh, I'm calling here from Minnesota, Makoche, which is the Dakota homelands. I have ancestors who were originally from here, but born and raised in South Dakota. Yeah, so happy to be here.
Okay, I'll go next. My name is Kristen Boss, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Historical Studies, the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and Women and Gender Studies at the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. I'm also the co-director of the Technoscience Research Unit, which is an Indigenous-led lab that houses many projects, but the one that I'm going to speak to today is the Environmental Data Justice Lab, where we research the relationship between colonialism, data, and pollution. I'm also Métis. I was born and raised here in Takaranto, but my homelands are in northern Alberta in Treaty 8 territory. I come to these lands through colonial practices and policies, including the 60s scoop, which see me as the third in 3 successive generations of scoops and adoptions. And so I come to my research as an Indigenous feminist, but as one who's not working on my own territory. And I think it's important to voice that because, as I think we'll discuss here today as well, being accountable to our various responsibilities as Indigenous peoples on our homelands, on other people's homelands, are vital to how we end extractivism. I'm really lucky at my lab to be guided by Michelle Murphy, who's also Métis, out from Winnipeg, and Vanessa Gray, who is an Anishinaabe land protector from Anjanong First Nation. And it is on her territory that we do our work and our research. And we try to follow the specific treaties and laws that govern Anishinaabe lands as a result of that. Our work is centered on Canada's Chemical Valley. It's about 3 hours from Toronto, and it's where 40% of Canada's petrochemicals are processed. It's also the home to Anishinaabe First Nation, who are experts in what it's like to live with pollution, having lived with it longer than Canada has even been a country. The first oil prospectors arrived decades before Confederation, and so in Chemical Valley, we really see how Canada is a company first, and as a company puts its industry relations over its own health and the health of Indigenous peoples, of course. So that's what I'm going to speak to today. So to get us started, I thought we could begin with how battles against resource extraction are also battles against policing. And I think we're all going to speak to our own experience and those of our comrades while we answer. So I'll let one of you go first. Uahikea?
Yeah, I can go first. This is a great question. And I love this question for thinking about specifically from the vantage point of Kanaka Maile opposition to the 30-meter telescope, but also astronomy industry development in general. And so on one hand, I often get questions like, but a telescope observatory is not like a natural gas or oil pipeline, despite the fact that in, state political hearings, there were politicians over the course of the past 5 years saying, we don't want a standing rock type situation at Mauna Kea. And that was Kai Kahele's words before he moved up in the world to the US House. And so there's this, on one hand, kind of curiosity about how resource extraction and extractivism in general relates to a telescope observatory. And on the other hand, this like latent refrain that almost in real time tries to work out how they are separate, when in fact, I think kind of subconsciously, it demonstrates very clearly a kind of link between the two. And as a really specific example, and then I'll kind of more specifically answer the question. I remember during the second raid at Wet'suwet'en, I was here in Takaranto, and I was sitting on my couch watching as, a good friend of mine, Tlingit scholar Anne Spice, was being arrested and detained at Wet'suwet'en during that raid. And as I was watching, I was also scrolling social media on Twitter, and I got a sponsored ad from the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which was a video that was of a band council member, I believe, talking about the positive economic benefits and educational advantages of supporting this particular natural gas pipeline, that is the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And within an hour, I also saw another sponsored ad by the 30-meter Telescope Corporation's social media account, which had a video eerily similar to the one that I just watched of a Native Hawaiian woman who was talking about the economic and educational benefits of supporting and building the 30-meter telescope. Lo and behold, I found out later that there had previously been a Canadian public relations company that was working for the 30-meter Telescope Corporation. And so in that kind of example, you see this enmeshing and mutual learning from a telescope corporation trying to build on Hawaiian sacred lands without free, prior, informed consent, and a natural gas pipeline corporation trying to build on unceded Wet'suwet'en territory, this pipeline, this natural gas pipeline, using the same kinds of rhetorical public relations strategies. And nevertheless, these are seen as separable. And so I find that eerily ironic because they're not. And conquests of other planets and beings in the universe, which the 30-meter telescope purports to do in the scientific case for exoplanet research, in this particular instance is only possible and animated through the colonization of indigenous peoples on this planet, on Earth. And so the assumption is basically that astronomy doesn't harm people or the environment and ecosystems because it purports to be for the benefit of all mankind and is a natural science. But its science extracts images, extracts information, extracts data. And I've learned a lot about this process from Mi'kmaq astronomer Hilding Nielsen, that this is an extractivist science, astronomy, and it extracts from the universe because of its technology and infrastructure that destroys and desecrates indigenous sacred sites and national lands on this planet. And so it's a really important connection to make that these projects are incredibly invested in the destruction of ecosystems that are untouched by development, like at Mauna Kea, the Northern Plateau. And in many ways, it's my belief that it's because these are folks that are so invested in discovering extraterrestrial life and making contact with aliens, or trying to find an Earth analog planet outside of our solar system that humans could one day settle in. So if that's kind of the perspective going into attempting to develop a project like this, it's easier to sanction and rationalize police violence against people that you believe are less than human than yourself, because you are attempting to do something that is so humanistic, to perpetuate literally the human species on another planet, or to discover the origins of human species through different kinds of astronomy. And so in 2019, this was on full display. We had a massive trotting out of police forces to criminalize and incarcerate kia'i, our word for protectors and guardians of Mauna Kea, but there's kia'i everywhere. Kia'i of Red Hill, Kapukaki, where the Red Hill Navy fuel bulk storage facility has leaked so much petroleum and so much jet fuel into the water aquifer and the water system that some of the water wells on Oahu Island are completely shut down and might never, ever be operable again, threatening not just Kanaka Maoli and Kia'i, but all people who are drinkers of water. So these are Kia'i, however, in 2019 that were criminalized for their stance to balance relations with Mauna Kea, to protect it from the desecration and destruction of the 30-meter telescope, from this kind of techno-scientific conquest, as I refer to it. And, when Maui PD, when Honolulu PD, when Hawaii PD trotted out in this massive sort of police operation, it was very telling to us because it was a precarious performance, right? We were asserting our sovereign jurisdiction over this territory. And in return, the settler state was anxious and insecure. And so the massive police operation that enveloped us, but didn't defeat us, was a representation of this precarity that the U.S. settler state has in Hawaii, has at the base of Mauna Kea, and has at the Mauna Kea summit region where these telescopes are built on stolen land.
Which I also got those ads at the same time, actually, like flooding my news feed. I mean, specifically also because we're working on industry. And so I remember them constantly, whether I hid them or not. And I think you bring up a lot of like tensions that we also have to consider here. I mean, specifically with that, the ways in which different relations that our community members might have to extractive projects. And maybe we can get to that after, of how we might work through some of those relations towards building foundations towards abolition. But I would love to hear from Nick too, your take on the link between policing and resource extraction.
Yeah, I think I think it's important to actually start with kind of the current state of affairs and the way that Canada and the United States and the North Atlantic powers are kind of really ramping up this, this kind of war in Ukraine for right, and wherever you fall in online with that, it's important to remember that this kind of like propaganda apparatus has been in place. And it's actually very detrimental to not only Indigenous people in Ukraine, but also Russia as sanction regimes kind of take effect. And there have been several statements issued by the Sami Council, especially those in the Russian Federation, as well as the Tatars, the Indigenous people of Crimea, and how this has impacted Indigenous people there. But it's also important to put into perspective how the geopolitics of energy production are really at the center of the United States and the EU's involvement, specifically because the fossil fuel industry is looking at this particular conflict as a crisis that it can capitalize on. And energy looms large in the question, but it's not the sole cause of the war. I think that's important to point out. And the war itself actually presents an opportunity for the fossil fuel industry to overcome one of its most difficult obstacles, which is Indigenous sovereignty. And another question looms. It's like, who will feed Europe's fossil fuel needs? And that question comes because Russia is the third largest oil producer and supplies Europe with about 27% of its oil imports and about 40% of its gas imports. In a country like the United States, Russia only offers about 3% of oil imports. But nonetheless, as we've seen, the cost of oil, by the barrel has gone up exponentially, primarily impacting poor, and vulnerable people, working people in North America specifically. So what does this have to do with Indigenous sovereignty? Well, we can go back to Indigenous sovereignty and policing. Well, we can go back to 2016 and look at how when the Obama administration had implemented some of the harshest sanctions against targeted sanctions against Venezuela, primarily targeting officials associated with its oil and gas industry, or its oil industry. And Venezuela, by the way, has the largest oil reserves in the world. It was a kind of geopolitical move because under Obama's watch, from 2008 to 2016, domestic oil and gas production increased by 88%, part of his domestic energy independence plan, right? Or what he liked to call the all of the above. We can have green energy alongside of fossil fuels. And so what we saw in leading up to 2016 in the standoff at Standing Rock, where you had over 97 different federal, state, and municipal law enforcement jurisdictions deployed against unarmed water protectors, you had the kind of continuation of the Obama era energy independence plan, but also you had of course, he denied the federal permit for the Keystone XL pipeline simply because it crossed an international border and it fell outside of his domestic energy plan. But nonetheless, the argument that was being made not only by the fossil fuel industry, but by Obama himself later, who also told a group of oil executives who reaped record profits during his administration to thank him at a Houston conference. His administration, as well as these oil executives, were basically making the argument that we want to stay away from quote unquote conflict oil and to develop our energy here at home, right? This nationalist rhetoric of economic sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. And we're also beat over the head with statistics that the oil and gas industry employs millions of workers, whether it's coming from the American Petroleum Institute or other such think tanks. Well, in fact, a recent report by the Food and Water Watch found that the oil and gas industry in the United States barely employs 500,000 workers, which is like less than 0.4% of the jobs. But and in fact, the oil and gas industry, even though production of oil has ramped up under Obama and under Trump, and therefore carbon emissions have drastically increased, we get more pollution, but jobs have actually shrunk. So this idea that the oil and gas industry is creating all these jobs and all this economic opportunity is falls on its face. And in fact, it's important to point out that Obama, and during his administration, actually employed the most oil and gas workers, and actually that we started to see this precipitous decline in oil and gas employment under Trump, and now into Biden's presidency as well. And so, again, to put this into perspective, it's important to point out that these are geopolitical machinations that are underway, and a lot of these oil and gas industry. There was a recent report that just came out from hold on, let me pull it up. I just read it. The Texas Alliance of Energy Producers found that the three main threats that these 500 companies, oil and gas companies, have identified. The first is federal overregulation, and atop among the other threats was public opinion towards the oil and gas industry, because everyone is now acknowledging climate change is a real thing and it's happening, as well as environmental activism / overreach, both about 25% as the top number one issue that are facing oil and gas companies. And to put that into perspective, a recent report by the Indigenous Environmental Network found that Indigenous-led movements in Canada and the United States are currently challenging a quarter of carbon emissions from two of the largest per capita carbon emitters, Canada and the United States. So Indigenous-led movements, whether it's through legislative actions, actions through lawsuits in court, or direct actions, chaining oneself to a pipeline, putting out blockades, etc., those movements are challenging about a quarter of the carbon emissions. That's like 1.3 billion metric tons of carbon that these movements are challenging, right? That's a phenomenal, we're overrepresented in terms of our demographics, both in Canada and the United States, according to, the majority populations. So they see Indigenous sovereignty as a primary obstacle in developing the oil and gas infrastructure in the United States. And they're also beginning to see it as a primary obstacle for the new green energy transition, which I don't really have time to get into, but nonetheless, the Biden administration, just days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was giving this speech to mining executives and heads of mining in the United States, Australia, and Canada, and making the argument that the green energy revolution, the transition away from fossil fuels, will require another kind of economic war with China, because China is currently supplying the majority of what they call critical strategic minerals, such as lithium, copper, etc. And so you see the development of lithium mines. One of the largest open pit lithium mines in the world is on Paiute land in Nevada. You see the Rio Tinto mine being, slotted or being promoted by both Obama, Trump, and now the Biden administration at the sacred site for the San Carlos Apache people in Oak Flat in Arizona. So you kind of see the same kind of mentality being promoted through all these successive administrations, when transition is only framed, as maintaining colonial extractive mentalities and colonial extractive processes, whether it's for fossil fuels or whether it's for green, critical minerals. And so it's also at the center of this are Indigenous people, challenging these kind of these larger geopolitical machinations, whether it's US sanctioning a third of the world's populations through unilateral and multilateral sanctions against companies or against nations it considers hostile, or whether it's, the slew of legislation coming through state governments criminalizing water protectors on one hand, or the oil and gas lawyers, the corporate lawyers from law firms such as Gibson and Dunn, trying to undermine tribal sovereignty through other means. And so when we talk about police abolition, we have to also think about how this is a larger kind of counterinsurgency operation that's being waged by one of the most powerful institutions in the history of this planet, whether it's the military on one hand, a state institution, or it's the fossil fuel industry on the other hand. And they're operating, hand in hand. And in the case of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which these corporate lawyers through Gibson Dunn are trying to undermine through a recent appeal at the Supreme Court, is basically to say that the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was meant to reverse the Indian child removal, the removal of Native children from their families, which constitutes the international legal definition of genocide, is in fact reverse racism, or that it impedes on states' rights. And for those of you who are from the United States, those two words, reverse racism and states' rights, we know the origins of those two arguments. They go back to anti-Black, racism and Jim Crow laws, right? To roll back the gains of Reconstruction, or to say that equality is oppression for white people, essentially. And it's the same argument that's being made. It's turning Indigenous sovereignty into a racialized argument to say that Indigenous people are not sovereign, political sovereigns, but in fact, they constitute races. And so the oil and gas industry understands that if they can undermine tribal sovereignty through these back channel ways by taking apart Indian child welfare legislation, laws meant to protect Native families, that they can undermine the larger legal superstructure of Indigenous sovereignty in general. That doesn't, I want to before I go on anymore, I'll just leave it at that, because I think that's an important aspect of this larger conversation. the social service, state social services, whether it's here in Minnesota or elsewhere in places like South Dakota with large Native populations, are specifically criminalizing Native families and Native children, right, through the foster care and the adoption system. And it's not just, out of benevolence in terms of, oh, we're going to save children from, parental neglect, but it's part of this larger process of destroying Native families, destroying to essentially destroy tribal sovereignty or to destroy Indigenous sovereignty, which stands as an impediment to the oil and gas industry. Sounds conspiratorial, but when you look at the actual people, the names who are showing up, in these kind of run-of-the-mill pedestrian custody hearings, these corporate law firms, whether they're from Los Angeles or New York City, are showing up and defending white parents because they understand that the largest threat to their bottom line, which is profits, primarily for the oil and gas or fossil fuel industry, is being threatened by tribal sovereignty.
You've given us so much to work with. I also want to add, just to pick up what you were saying, no, it's definitely not out of benevolence. And it's obviously part of a larger process to destroy Native peoples. And in our lab, we like to take the structural analysis and think through carceral logic and technologies within resource industry through gaslighting. And so I'm going to show some pictures here just to give you a little bit of context as well. Give me 1 second because I was not planning to share my screen so much. But I'm going to show you this picture. So this picture was taken on February 23rd, 2017. It's from a video. It's a still shot. And as you can see, if I were to ask you what you saw in this picture, I think you would probably say, well, it looks like something is on fire because something was obviously on fire. And so this is a very violent flaring incident at the Imperial Oil Refinery in southwestern Ontario's Chemical Valley. We can see the facility that it's engulfed in flames. Where Chemical Valley sits, it sits on the border. So this is the view, I believe, from across Lake Michigan, so from the US. And yeah, so it's got the St. Clair River there, Canada on the one side, and the US on the other. And so while local folks captured images like this of this refinery and this event on their cell phones, data from the government and industry was extremely sparse. And I'll show you. So after all this footage was caught and this refinery goes on fire, it's engulfed in flames, Imperial responds and says that they are responding to a grass fire, that this is a grass fire event, and that all issue, as you can see, was cleared. And then this is a collection of data that was taken by Amjadong Solidarity against Chemical Valley. Or I believe actually this is Amjad and Sarnia against pipelines. But here is a timeline. So we see a notice for high flaring coming through. And then we also see on February 23rd, we have this code 8, but then we see all of this follow up, right? And these are, just to clarify, these are the alerts that come out when there are incidents like this, if they are reported and if they are circulated within community. But as we know that Imperial responds, it's a grass fire. Now, there was a subsequent legal investigation that was launched by EcoJustice and Vanessa Gray that essentially came up with no wrongdoing found. And so in our lab, we kind of explain this through gaslighting. So gaslighting being a form of abuse that manipulates victims into doubting their own memory, perception, and reality. And we see this particularly within the environmental justice work we do, where industry undermines our reality, our lived experience, our research by denying the facts of the world around them and of their own harms. And we see this in the research that we do, and we see it in the form of like literally blatant lies. We see denying of events that took place, even when there's evidence, even when there's video footage. One of the things that happens in the context where we research is that some of the refineries will say, oh, we have fence line monitoring, like we are taking care of the problem. But the, fence line monitoring is fence line, and smokestacks and plumes are quite a bit up. And so it's not even catching, right? Part of this gaslighting is also that it, as Nick says, that it's not out of benevolence. It's part of a larger strategy. It is well known. The Imperial Oil Refinery that we work on is the oldest operating refinery in the world. It's also the highest emitting in Chemical Valley, and it is majority owned by ExxonMobil, who has, of course, known about climate change since the 1970s. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now, but if I lost my, there we go. But I wanted to just kind of share this story and show some pictures just to kind of get to the fact that when we are thinking about resource extraction, we are dealing with these industries, there is a lot of work on their side that they do to try to undermine how we understand the situation and how we know the situation. And this is part of the carceral technologies. It's part of these strategies. It's been going on for decades. And I think it's really important that we start to bring these to light and start to articulate them and share them as we find them. And as Nick and Wahike are saying, part of this work and part of doing this kind of recording is ultimately linked to our sovereignty, our own sovereignty as Indigenous peoples, and building a foundation for abolition that will not require global extraction. And so I would like, now that we've got a little bit more situation, to think specifically about the ways in which abolition and Indigenous sovereignty are linked. And both Nick and Uahikea are part of the Red Nation, who published an incredible book, The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth. I've got both my classes reading from it this semester, and so I was hoping we could pull from here as well. Nick, Wahike?
Sure. Thanks so much for that. That's quite astonishing. I mean, quite nightmarish photos that you're sharing. And it kind of reminds me of that film, what's it called, Groundhogs Day, like when Bill Murray is like waking up and like he remembers that time is passing, but he's like told that it's this, it's like he's like reliving the same day over and over again. And in some ways I feel like that's what it's like to be an Indigenous person in the settler colonial like nation. It's like we have this kind of collective memory of things like, well, no, like it's the same thing. And they'll be like, no, it's, but it's the same day, it's a different day, like all these kinds of things. So it kind of just reminded me of that. But I do want to say, in terms of the Red Deal, that the primary inspiration from that particular book came from the 2010 Cochabamba People's Agreement, which was drafted by thousands of environmental activists, socialists, Indigenous people, Indigenous movements, left movements in Cochabamba in 2010. And it was a very, a very kind of like revolutionary document in many ways, because it talked about climate justice from the perspective of Indigenous people, as well as from the perspective of the global South. And what that really meant was it introduced this concept, or theorized this concept of climate debt, which is completely out of the conversation, it seems like, in the global North. But their argument was, because these nations and these people of the global South cannot develop along the same path as the United States and those countries of the of the North Atlantic, because it would require literally 3 planets in terms of atmosphere space to pollute, as well as minerals and things to consume, right? That they should be provided with the resources as a form of justice, because many of those resources had been taken from those places, as a form of justice and reparations, to allow them to develop in a way that isn't destructive, right? And according to their own needs. And of course, countries like the United States and Canada, which have been plundering the global South, for generations and have been plundering native lands for generations, kind of laughed it off, right? But there's also other kind of aspects within the 2010 Cochabamba Accords, a People's Agreement, that really spelled out kind of the basis of what we're talking about as well. They said, how is it that the United States, I'll speak about the United States, I don't know what it is for Canada, but how is it the United States spends so much money on its military and spends so much money on keeping people in prisons, but it can't find the decency to not only house its own people, feed its own people, but also its primary export is violence to the rest of the world. And why can't it use the ill-gotten social wealth that has accumulated and amassed from the rest of the world through surplus value? You know, the only reason why we have a military the size that it is, the only reason why we have incarceration, prisons, and police the way that it is because the United States has, this is what imperialism is. It has extracted the wealth of the rest of the world and accumulated it. But instead of even, you know, doing what some imperialist nations like, you know, those of, you know, Western Europe do and kind of give out kind of basic, you know, social kind of democratic, you know, things such as free healthcare, housing guarantees, etc. It is instead invested in maintaining its power and dominance by creating, you know, 800 overseas military bases. You want to talk about imperialism? No other country has that many military bases. I think China has 2, you know, that's their number 2, right? And so when we talk about the Red Deal, we're saying that the United States has the resources to not only pay its climate debt to the world, but also to maintain a dignified life for its people, and, you know, to uphold its fundamental agreements that it made with Indigenous people first and foremost, to fulfill those, whether it's through land back, etc. And so, like, it's not that it doesn't have the resources. The United States could end poverty, could end homelessness, could end the needless suffering because of COVID-19. You know, unlike Canada, we had access to vaccines, but we're still like far more unvaccinated than, you know, than Canada itself. You know, it could end all of this needless suffering, but it chooses not to because there's not political will to do so. And that, to me, represents not only a danger for Indigenous people, because we are always the first to be sacrificed. War in Ukraine, sanctions against Russia, oil and gas, we need to drill baby drill, right? Whether it's in Alberta, whether it's in, you know, the Northern Plains, whether it's in Texas, that directly impacts Indigenous people, right? And so when we wrote the Red Deal, that's what we had in mind. Abolition isn't just a project for the United States, right? Even though the United States has, like, I think it's 20% of the world's prison population and only represents about 5% of the world's population in general, it's also about re-envisioning and reimagining a decolonial future that's premised on justice and dignified lives, not only for human beings, but all of our relations. And yeah, maybe that sounds like an unrealistic project in many ways, but what does it mean? Like, going back to the points that I made earlier, what does it mean when the minority of minorities of Canada and the United States are challenging a quarter of carbon emissions from both countries? There's something there that needs to be paid attention to and needs to be, you know, we need to study and take guidance from those insights. And if we go back to this jobs argument that I was talking about earlier, Native people and Indigenous caretakers, Indigenous land defenders, whether you're Lakota, Dakota, Métis, wherever you find yourself in, whether you're Kanaka Maile, it is a job, it is work, it is labor to take care of these places, right? That is founded on generations since time immemorial of knowledge and how to caretake these places. That is, you know, much like a feminized labor, much like domestic labor, is something that, quote unquote, goes unpaid, right? Because of its relation to capital. It's seen as almost as an impediment, or something that's, you know, that should be used as free, you know, like whether it's, you know, Indigenous land defenders or African descendant land defenders in the Amazon rainforest, literal heart or the literal lungs of the planet. They're not getting paid to defend, the air we all breathe. But nonetheless, capitalism and imperialism sees it as a free kind of gift for it to perpetuate its profit, machine. And so when we think about this in terms of like going back to, just a local struggle here against the Line 3 pipeline, the Enbridge, the Canadian-owned energy corporation, Enbridge, which is pumping tar sands from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico for refinement, claimed that it had created, I think it was like 5,000 jobs. And it took like 5 billion gallons of fresh water out of our aquifer systems here, as well as the groundwater, to build this project. And now we found out that it has leaked, it has punctured 3 major aquifers, and is facing paltry fines for doing that. But nonetheless, it threatens because not only because of a potential oil spill, but because of climate change in general, it perpetuates. It's like, I think it's 350. Or it's like building 50 coal-fired power plants. The emissions that will come out of the Line 3 pipeline are almost double that of the emissions of the entire state of Minnesota, to put that into perspective. And the ricers, the people who harvest monomen, which is, the Anishinaabe word for rice, wild rice, nobody even talked about their jobs and how they're impacted. The fact that these families, generation after generation, not only do it for cultural reasons and to maintain their connection to the land itself, but also do it as a source of income, are now being impacted and potentially will lose their livelihoods, right? And so at the center of this, when we talk about jobs, labor, caretaking, we have to really rethink what we understand as like Indigenous sovereignty, right? Because it's not just about what the colonizer lays out, in terms of what we can and cannot do. Treaties, I mean, if you're a treaty nation, that's one thing, so I'll just speak as a treaty nation. Treaties don't make nations. Nations make treaties, right? And we can also make other kinds of agreements and protocols, right? We don't have to wait for, the colonizing nation to say, yeah, it's okay to do so. There's much more to say about that, but that's kind of the general gist of what we were thinking about with the Red Deal. And it's a very slim book, right? And so it's a collaborative book. We're asking to be in conversation. Like we're not the end all be all of this conversation. We hope that people take it to their communities and identify the specific needs and struggles in their communities and adapt it, and to think not just at a local scale, but to think about it and put it into like a global context.
Just want to quickly add, if I can, about this question about the Red Deal as it relates to abolition and Indigenous sovereignty. Another main facet running through the Red Deal regarding abolition and Indigenous sovereignty is taken from Sarah Deer's argument. Sarah Deer is a lawyer and scholar who's Creek, about ending sexual violence against Indigenous women in Indian country in specific. And she says that the purest exercise of Indigenous sovereignty or tribal sovereignty is the adjudication of rape, sexual assault, and gendered violence. And so for us in the Red Nation, this means, as a part of the Red Deal, that abolition means ending missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, LGBTQ plus folks globally, not just in North America, right? This is a epidemic transnationally. And so taking that as kind of a instruction and framework and thinking about abolition, Deer isn't necessarily invested in investing in more policing to criminalize and incarcerate, Indigenous folks, isn't invested in increasing the amounts of carceral institutions, whether it's child welfare services like Nick was talking about previously, or prisons themselves. Instead, thinking about a exercise of Indigenous sovereignty, jurisdiction, and self-determination that adjudicates these particular gendered, sexualized forms of violence can be the purest form of our sovereignty. And I think that this is really important for the way that we talk also about abolition in the book, right? It isn't about investing in the systems that cause harm. It's about doing away with them and unsettling them. And so I would also go as far as to say that another sort of exercise of sovereignty for Indigenous peoples and nations is to abolish these carceral institutions, these technologies and logics, the police, child welfare services, prisons, detainment facilities, and camps, removing these institutions that contain our people at disproportionate rates, but also other peoples, right? Black folks, migrants, trans folks coming from the global South. And this means abolition on other people's territories. And so I wanted to just come around back to what settler state sovereignty looks like in this conversation about abolition, right? So currently the state of Hawaii has a contract with Saguaro Corrections Facility, which is a private owned prison in the Southwest on Tohono O'odham territory and land that is owned and operated by CoreCivic. And if you don't know who CoreCivic is, it's they're formally named the Corrections Corporation of America. It's one of the largest private prison corporations in North America. And this particular contract the state of Hawaii has with CoreCivic removes incarcerated and detained Kanaka Maoli Native Hawaiian men from prisons because of a quote unquote, as the governor David Ige likes to say, there just aren't enough prisons. And partly that's because Hawaii is overdeveloped. So folks like Mark Zuckerberg and others can have their, $1 million mansions in and across Hawaii. But so there's not enough prisons to house Native Hawaiian men. So they're shipping Native Hawaiian men to Arizona, where the Saguaro Corrections Facility is. And as a result, that particular facility's inmate population is 50% Kanaka Maoli men. 50%, half of that prison is populated by Native Hawaiian men because of not just the prison industrial complex, but because of the incarceration and subsequent removal of Indigenous Hawaiian men from their ancestral, traditional territories, families, lahui, nation, and peoplehood. And meanwhile, CoreCivic is profiting off of this on Tohono O'odham land. So what does it mean, right, to call for prison abolition in Hawaii, but not to call for prison abolition elsewhere, for instance, or to call for prison abolition on Tohono O'odham territory, but not to call for prison abolition in Hawaii, right? These are interconnected systems of not just colonial settlement and colonial violence, but also the private prison industry and the prison industrial complex. And what it means is that as Indigenous peoples and nations, we need to be thinking globally about how to exercise these forms of solidarity as expressions of our sovereignty to abolish prisons and also to abolish police. In the past 2 years, there have been a uptick in police murders in Hawaii. And, people like to think of Hawaii as this paradise, right? There's no racism, there's no violence, there's no hatred. And this is a narrative that sociologists sold and anthropologists sold about Hawaii as a way to get the United States to incorporate Hawaii into the Union, right? As the 50th state in the middle of the 20th century and eventually statehood in 1959. Because previously in the 30s and 20s, there was also these ideas that Hawaii was an incredibly violent place because of racism, right? This is why we have the 1932 Massey affair, where a Hawaiian man and a group of other racialized people in Hawaii were accused of raping a white woman who happened to be the wife of a naval commander. And when they were acquitted and not charged with sexual assault, that family murdered Joseph Kahahawai, right? So that was the kind of racial hate and violence that the US was like, no, we don't want those folks in the United States. But then later, because of sociologists and anthropologists, that narrative flipped on its head. But the truth is, people who are even visiting Hawaii and settling, like Lindeni Mayeni, who was a black South African person that was living in Hawaii with his wife and his child, was brutally murdered by police. And those police were acquitted of their brutality. I remember SciCap. Both of these folks were murdered in the past few years. A Micronesian Chuukese boy who was accused of stealing a purse was shot 8 times in the back by police officers. And we say Hawaii is this racial melting pot. But the truth is that you can dress us up in blue and you can give us tasers and guns, but our blood will never bleed blue. The problem is that these fascist alt-right ideas coming from the United States and coming from the North American and from neo-Nazis are infiltrating the way that Kanaka Maoli and other people think about police in Hawaii. Meanwhile, they're still killing Micronesians, Black folks, and our own people at disproportionate rates. And so, when Chamorro scholar Julian Aguan says to hell with drowning, in terms of like to hell with thinking about how Pacific Island peoples and nations are just going to drown out in this anthropogenic global destruction of our planet, which also is externalized to people in Oceania and the Pacific, in ways that people don't make that connection to, right? Like we're not in the West, we're not in North America, we're in the Pacific, right? And countries like Micronesia are feeling the effects of climate change in terrible ways, right? But just like to hell with drowning, as Julian Aguan says, to hell with drowning in terms of experiencing these disproportionate rates of incarceration and policing. And that is why the Red Deal provides a platform for thinking about how to exercise Indigenous sovereignty in these pure forms, to adjudicate gendered and sexual violence, and also to abolish the police and prisons.
Yeah, that was incredible. I'm like, yeah, so obviously, accountability is crucial to abolition and in building a foundation for abolition, rethinking jobs, rethinking lies about jobs. It's funny, Nick, in Chemical Valley as well, we see the same lies about jobs. When we are researching the histories and the operations of all of the facilities that work there, ultimately we see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people are being employed by this one facility, right? But this myth that it's bringing so much value and so much capital to the community persists. And it allows for new and better infrastructures, constantly innovating. So I would like to think about, kind of the practices that get us towards abolishing all forms of carcerality. And I'll start a little bit. So in our lab is Indigenous run. And we have a series of values and protocols. And so one of our values and protocols are care and reciprocity. Now that is those are very big things, right? And many responsibilities are inside of them, but at a core level, it's about holding space and making space for each other and our relations within the university, which is crucial to reclaiming alternative research spaces where we can actually have these conversations. And so I was thinking about yesterday, actually, the opening panel with Ronaldo Walcott and how he was giving some really compelling, he was saying that he doesn't necessarily trust us as researchers when we continue to kind of float up into the ivory towers and the upper echelons of administration and was asking us, what risks are we willing to take with our own research, with our own relationships, with our own progress to the university? And so in our lab, we like to really center radical tenderness and mutual support. I mean, mutual support and mutual aid is key, as a lot of us are activist scholars, community researchers who are actively targeted by the police. You might have heard as well in the opening sessions, my collaborator and comrade, Vanessa Gray, has been targeted and was targeted in her own home and arrested by the Toronto Police Services in cooperation with the Canadian Pacific Railway cops. They're private cops with full jurisdiction to do what regular cops do, but with even less transparency than regular cops. And so we like to start with radical tenderness towards each other and mutual support and mutual aid. And how this manifests as our research is that we also refuse the extractive logics of research itself, right? Like the ways in which we are expected as researchers to go into communities, sometimes our own, sometimes not our own, and extract data. And so specifically, we're working with pollution data, environmental data, relies on extraction usually. And so we try to use non-extractive research practices. So like we don't collect any data, for example. We use what we've got and we try to responsibilize it and embed it within an understanding of colonial history and settler colonialism. And for us, this simply means in our own research on pollution that we start with accountability to the land. And so I think, again, accountability, abolition, accountability to the land as being central to abolition. So we're thinking of like, how can we make data that works for our communities? How can we hold pollution data up to both First Nations, in this case, elders and youth standards? How do we relate pollution to everyday experiences of spills and releases, right? Like, how do we cut through all of that gaslighting? How do we cut through all of that to get to an accessible kind of data that cares for land and futures and values community knowledge? So yeah, I wanted to just start with care and reciprocity. And I did want to ask both of y'all, what kind of practices that you've taken or you've learned that you think will get us to where we need to be?
I'll just answer that really quickly, or as quick as possible, because I know we're running up against time. And I'd love to answer the question in terms of practicality and pragmatics and what to do, especially about ending extraction, whether it's like a logic in research, like you're saying, academic, industrial knowledge production, right? Like this is about the 30-meter telescope to me in my mind, but it's also about materiality too, right? And so I want to end with that. I get a lot of folks asking me about how to decolonize science, how to indigenize astronomy. And I'm just not interested in those two projects. And what I am interested in, though, is more anti-extractive thought, like I was describing with Mi'kmaq scholar Hilding Nielsen. Like, how does one consider astronomy practices and study in a sort of philosophy that's against extraction on Earth and in the universe, right? But also, what I tend to advocate for folks asking me about decolonizing science and indigenizing astronomy is this means, and it's not a question I really care that much about for these two projects, but the question I think that does matter for me and should matter for others is, how am I going to start to work towards decommissioning telescope observatories rather than thinking about how to decolonize science or indigenize astronomy? Let's start there. And so I want to end by talking a little bit about a new French study that was actually released just yesterday by some astronomers and scientists that suggests actually that active astronomy research currently via space missions and physical observatories on land and territory. And so they analyzed 39 observatories and 46 space missions that are actively animating different astronomy research, has a carbon footprint of 20 million tons, which is approximately the same as some countries. And they cite a bunch of countries like Estonia. So I thought this was interesting. And I looked further into these particular observatory projects that they used to make this analysis and conclusion. 4 of the top emitting observatories are on Hawaii Island, not just at Mauna Kea, 3 of them, but 1 at Mauna Loa across the way in the saddle at Hawaii Island. One of those telescopes at Mauna Kea is the Canada-France Hawaii Telescope. And that telescope observatory, existing Canadian capital, right? If TMT has not been built, the CFHT telescope has, and it exists at Mauna Kea. The Canadian astronomy community is trying its damnedest to renovate it into the Mauna Kea spectroscopic explorer. And so the Canadian astronomy community is faced with this really big dilemma: how to advocate for TMT while at the same time trying to secretly renovate its already existing telescope that's emitting at a significant amount in this study. And so the French researchers say, development for astronomy needs to slow down. And I find that just so disingenuous, because it's indigenous land defenders like Kia'i that have done that slowing, right? It relates to what Nick was saying, right? Indigenous peoples and land defenders are overdetermined in these efforts to decarbonize the atmosphere. And geopolitically all over the world. And so the last thing I'll say is just this: how do I see ending extraction? You know, if the space cowboys we consider of today are Elon Musk and company, then the frontiersmen of space colonization are astronomers. It's time those astronomers, astrophysicists, and cosmologists that have previously not considered themselves as much see themselves as just another side of the same coin.
Yeah, I think what Ua brought up, I don't really want to add too much to that because I think it's very succinct. And I do want to say before, since I have the closing thoughts, I just want to thank the ASL interpreters, Lavender and Gregorio. Apologies for talking so fast, but you've done an excellent job. And also to Kristen and the organizers to this panel, it's been really great. I do want to just say, like, this is less of a, I think what you brought up, Kristen, is a very good practice as well. Just kind of some basic principles. Don't talk to cops. Don't talk to feds. Like, we have a like, that seems like hard to do, but I know a lot of researchers out there who think they're doing the right thing, but in fact are becoming informants. So don't be an informant. Be a good relative. Be a good relative, not only to, as we say in Lakota, it's like, don't be a good relative, not only to this generation, but to the future generations. Be a good ancestor to the future. And think about that, in everything that you do. And that's not just, as water protectors, as the kind of the idea of the water protector became very prominent in 2016. Obviously, water protectors existed prior to that, but something unique happened at Standing Rock, right? And we are in this era of the water protector, as we can see by the amazing, advances, done at like Oahu and shutting down Red Hill, right? And really throwing a wrench into the imperialist machine as it, colonizes the Pacific, right? And thinking about how, not only is it just a kind of an act of resistance, but it's also an act of love. So it's a love for the forthcoming, generations. And I think we, in this moment in time, it's very dire. Like, I'm not going to lie. I don't think we should, as like revolutionaries, as organizers, as Indigenous people, we should never lie to people. And we should actually assess objectively the reality. And I think the reality that we're living in right now is very, very dire. It's very bleak. But in the kind of dire and bleakness, we can't like forego our principles. We can't back down our principles. We can't water them down. We have to stand by them steadfastly in no matter what comes, because the literal future of the planet is at stake. And so what that means is not only just being like super militant and oppositional, right, but also being for something. And to understand that, like, as you said, Kristen, reciprocity and being a good relative and making good relations with each other, but also, understanding that this moment is very, very stressful for a lot of people. Mental health is a huge issue. I was speaking with one of my Bolivian friends, she's Quechua, and she was talking about one of the things that shocked her is that, she grew up in poverty, she grew up in La Campo. But she was like, why is it that there's that suicide and, social alienation are such a common feature of Western society, right? And so I think about that in terms of how colonization operates on multiple registers, and how we as organizers and people who try to be good people of the earth and good relatives also have to operate on multiple registers against the onslaught of something that is literally trying to wipe us out of existence. And we have to take that challenge very seriously, while also being very humble about how we go about it and the interactions and the relationships that we make. So that's all I would like to offer, is to really think about being a good relative in this moment in time, because it's very scary. It is a very scary time.
What?
I think that about ends our teach-in today.
So thank you for watching. And yeah, miigwech.